Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Very excited for our virtual Commission on the Status of Women meeting, and lovely to have everyone from all over the world. Again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Ritu Sharma. I'm the Vice President for Policy Advocacy at CARE USA. I think many of you are probably familiar with CARE's work, but we center women and girls and gender in everything that we do. And women's economic empowerment is central to our agenda, not just in our programs, but in our advocacy at the national level, at the level of donors, and at the global level with institutions like the UN and others. So we're really delighted to be part of this event and part of the new We Prosper coalition. So today we're going to be hearing from the governments of Spain and Sweden. You'll hear a little bit more about the new coalition from our host organization, International Center for Research on Women. And then we will go into a very lively panel discussion. So again, thanks for joining us and warm welcome if you've just come on the line. We will not have a traditional formal Q&A, but I want to invite you to use the chat feature to introduce yourselves as you come on and to share any thoughts or questions that you might have. We'll be able to get back to you in the chat and after the event. So once again, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. I want to introduce our government speakers. Thank you both for joining us. First, we have María Jesús Conde Zabala, is the Ambassador at Large for Feminist Foreign Policy of Spain. We celebrate and are delighted in your title, Ambassador Conde. We hope to see more countries embrace a ambassador for feminist foreign policy. The ambassador has a degree in law, a master's degree in art, and 2 postgraduate degrees in European law and international trade. She has been the director of human rights in the Basque government. She's a professor of sociology of law and a judge in the criminal court of Bilbao. She is a regional child protection officer for UNICEF and has been the UNICEF representative in Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and Bulgaria. Welcome, Ambassador, and I will hand it over to you for your remarks.
Thank you very much. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this meeting, this parallel event. And I'm very happy to join you and to share some of the ideas and the principles of the Spanish feminist foreign policy. Feminist and women movements have made visible the unequal structures and have helped create transformative changes across the world. However, the prevalence of inequalities between women and men continues, and gender considerations too often remain in the margins of the policy decisions. Even in crisis and conflict situations, as we are seeing in these days, for instance, in the climate crisis or the COVID-19, or even though in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Even though in the recent years, Spain has played a leading role in promoting women's rights and gender equality to accelerate the 2030 agenda, it was in 2021, last year, when the president of the government launched the Feminist Foreign Policy Guide. In this way, Spain joined the group of countries such as Sweden, Canada, Mexico, Luxembourg, and France that had incorporated gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls as a hallmark of their foreign policy. The participation of women in equal condition in political, economic, and social life is a cross-cutting issue in the Spanish national agenda by constitutional mandate. Our feminist diplomacy extends the commitment of the government to equality and women's rights to the international domain, including multilateral, bilateral, regional diplomacy, European relations, and of course, the international cooperation for development. For Spain, counting on a feminist foreign policy means first having more women in the foreign service, ambassadors and head of missions, and supporting that more women also lead regional and international organizations, reach senior positions. Second, what is the most difficult is mainstreaming gender approach in all our international relations, political positions and actions. And the third one is prioritizing the women, peace and security agenda, the eradication of violence against women and girls, the respect of human rights, the meaningful participation, and of course, the economic justice and empowerment. We have seen that everywhere COVID pandemic has had a profound impact on women and girls' work, economy, health, and education. Women make up 70% of the frontline health workers, perform most of the formal and informal care work, and participate overwhelmingly in the labor market. Women and girls have suffered the higher rates of violence during the pandemic and have been the most affected by the closure of schools and the collapse of the health services. 2 years after the beginning of this severe crisis, we need more than ever investments that guarantee women's access to decent employment, care leave policies, including maternity and paternity protection, childcare and long-term care services, and of course, the control over their own time, lives, and bodies. According to the 2021 report of the European Institute for Gender Equality, at the current pace, it will take more than 3 generations to achieve gender equality in the European Union. So the work that we have in front is amazing. As Spain, is co-leading the Economic Justice and Rights Coalition of the Generation Equality Forum. And in this context, our government approved last week the 3rd strategic plan for effective equality between women and men for the period 2022-2025. This plan has an allocation of 20 billion euros. And 91% of the total budget goes to the creation of decent employment, closing the gender pay gap, fighting job insecurity, and strengthening the maternal and parental leave and the provision of care services. In the international arena, as we are just to mention some of the ongoing initiatives supported by Spain, such as the Forum of African Women Business Leaders, the Women 20 Group of the Empowerment Network, and the recent platform Hear Us, created to contribute to the professional and economic integration of Afghan women in Europe and, of course, in Spain. We all want to embrace every opportunity to ensure that gender equality is in the center of the policy decisions and the recovery from the crisis is sustainable, transformative, and feminist. This commitment drives us to do more to close the socioeconomic inequalities, the sexual division of labor, and the concentration of power. I think that collective global action and all its members can count on Spain to accelerate the pace towards economic, climate, and gender justice. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ambassador. And we very, very much appreciate the efforts of the Spanish government to center gender and women's empowerment in your policies and programming. So again, look forward to more countries taking up the leadership mantle from you all. I want to introduce now Ulrika Grandin is as the Deputy Director at the coordination team of the Feminist Foreign Policy at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ms. Grandin has had several positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, dealing with EU matters and development cooperation. She has spent some time also at Sweden's Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, which we all know has been one of the standard bearers for gender equality around the world. So over to you, Ulrika.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. As you heard, I'm working with the Sweden's feminist foreign policy in our team in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Very happy to be here. And for Sweden, women's economic empowerment is central to our feminist government and to our feminist foreign policy. And it has also been a very central component of Sweden as a welfare state in building this from the 70s and forward. And as we all know, without gender equality, we are less likely to have economic prosperity in society without half the population participating. And as we all know, sustainable development will be harder to achieve without gender equality. And there are also studies saying that welfare states with a large part of women participating is also a state more resilient to crisis, which is very much on our radar now with the circumstances in the world, of course. And also in the pandemic, we have seen that societies with social protection systems and women participating in the labor market have been a little bit more resilient. And also, as we all know, for us and for everyone, without women's economic empowerment, it's harder for a woman to participate in political life. It's harder for a woman to leave an abusive relationship. It's harder to get access to your sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is something that we, as Sweden, is working a lot for. But still, economic gender equality is the area in gender equality issues that is the furthest behind. And that is why, as our eminent ambassador from Spain said, we are active as countries in the Action Coalition for Economic Justice and Rights, together with you in Spain and together with South Africa, Mexico, OECD, ILO, several CISOs and others. And for Sweden, we have 3 priorities in our work in this Action Coalition. And this is the work to eliminate discriminatory laws. It's still a majority of countries that have laws that discriminate against women, and not least their participation in the labor market and in the economy. And this must really end. We also work a lot for social and economic reforms, and this is kind of built on what we think has been a component that has been really central for our welfare state. And this is, we usually take up 3 reforms, and this is individual taxation, not by couple or by family. So once women were taxated by their income individually, this made a great difference for their participation in the labor market and to get their own economies. Of course, childcare has been completely central for women's participation in the labor market. And also quite a generous parental leave, preferably divided by men and women. Social protection systems in all stages of life, and this includes, of course, pensions and other social security systems. But we also lift the reforms we've had on SRHR have the right to decide over your own body and when you're going to get pregnant or not has been a really central component for women's participation in the labor market. And this, of course, in Sweden, as in so many other countries, has been pushed from a very strong women's rights movement, a women's movement that have been central. So a strong component for us in our feminist foreign policies to support women's rights organizations all over the world. And this includes, of course, at the moment also to be able to support grassroots women's rights organizations in Ukraine and elsewhere. We do this through umbrella organizations like Urgent Action Fund is one example that we support that get directly to women's rights organizations on the ground. But I would also like to underline the importance of statistics and data. I know we talk about that a lot, but to get the facts on the table, to really see that women's economic empowerment means a lot for economic growth, means a lot for societal development. We really have to have the facts because there's so many prejudices and, as we know, strong social norms that prevail. And if we have the facts on the table, it's more difficult to argue. And I would also like to maybe underline our feminist trade policy. And it's the same here actually with the facts and data. We have discovered, as many of you, that trade is benefiting men more than women. In trade, there are taxes that are higher on women's products than on men's products. And these facts are talking its own language. It's really necessary that trade benefits all, women and men. And this also includes, of course, facilitating for women to to starting their own companies and also to be leaders in the private sector. And there is a significant proof that gender equality would increase growth of trade and growth of the global economy. And I know that our trade minister, she is also looking a lot at women's participation in trade. And apparently when it comes to venture capital and to really get that kind of financing that is risk-taking, it's so many more men. The women's access to this capital is very low. So I would also like to maybe highlight the potential of green jobs and the green economy for women's participation in the labor market. And we have seen, and especially thinking of the theme of CSW this year, and gender equality really matters for greening the economy in many ways. And this concerns areas like consumption patterns, access to economic and productive resources, information and technology, the ecological footprint, for example. And primary sectors in the green economy are expected to be in areas like agriculture, forestry, and energy, which are sectors that women worldwide is very dependent on and also active in. So we really see a great potential for women to be the kind of transformers in the green economy. And for that, of course, we need to really support women's education and women's possibilities to get the skills to be active in the green economy. And we see a lot of good examples, for example, in the renewable energy sector and in ecotourism. And lastly, I would also like to highlight the importance of women's role as trade union representatives and to be in what we call the social dialogue on the labor market. Once we have that social dialogue, women can claim their rights to equal pay and also to things like parental leave. So we have this initiative called Global Deal for Decent Work and Participation in the labor market together with the OECD and the ILO that we see as a very important initiative. But to conclude, for us, as I know many of you, gender equality and not least women's economic empowerment is so central to a modern and green welfare state. And we really have to realize this now in order to build back from the pandemic and make a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ulrika, and very much appreciate the philosophy and vision that Sweden has brought to the world in terms of how to embed gender equity in all different kinds of economic policy. So thank you so much for your leadership and for being with us today. I would like to introduce Kelsey Harris, who's the Senior Global Policy Advocate at ICRW and coordinator of the new We Prosper Coalition and a member of our steering committee. So please, Kelsey, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ritu. And thank you to Ambassador Conde and Ms. Grandin for sharing your perspectives on women's economic empowerment globally and offering us some insight into the ways our coalition can support commitments and drive global progress around women's economic empowerment. Before sharing a little bit more context about our coalition, I also want to take this moment to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for your support and thought partnership around We Prosper. In addition, we couldn't be here today without the dedication and contributions of We Prosper Steering Committee and our members. So my deep thanks go out to all of you. As Ritu noted, I serve as the coordinator for the coalition, and I've had the honor over the last several months of helping to establish and grow this new global coalition on women's economic empowerment, We Prosper. In this moment, we hold ourselves accountable to the commitment that we made at the Generation Equality Forum to establish a new collaborative coalition on We under the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition. We feel that this initiative is urgently needed to catalyze global dialogue and convene stakeholders like now as the world builds towards an inclusive recovery from COVID-19 and works to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. This event is just the beginning of that dialogue, and moving forward, we're excited to work with all of you towards meaningful change. We Prosper has over 35 members so far, including local, regional, and global civil society organizations, academic institutions, advocacy organizations, women-led and feminist groups, and private sector entities. Together, we span the sectors and the globe, and thus provide unique collective insights on the range of issues, contexts, and barriers that impact women's economic empowerment, including what works and what doesn't work to advance we. Our coalition takes a holistic approach to this complex topic. We believe that addressing structural economic and social issues is at the root of ensuring justice, rights, and empowerment for women and girls in all their diversity. While well-intentioned, we have seen a narrow focus on we in the past, and it's very clear from the evidence that if we don't address these structural issues and broaden the conversation, progress will stall. During the panel discussion that's coming up, you're going to hear from my colleagues on some of these specific structural issues and how evidence-backed policy can help to address them. Moving forward, We Prosper aims to build the evidence and understanding around the we issues and serve as a bridge from research to policy to drive more results-focused change. But that's all just the top layer of what we're seeking to do. To learn more, I'm pleased to share a new brief that we have put together that further outlines We Prosper's holistic approach to women's economic empowerment. A link to it will be dropped in the chat momentarily. We invite you to take a look to gain an understanding of how we're going to work to build the evidence base and what we hope to achieve through our strategic advocacy. And we hope you'll join us as we collectively get to work. In the meantime, before turning it back to Ritu and our excellent speaker lineup, I want to share a short video with you to better illustrate We Prosper's approach and to introduce you to some of our members and our partners.
Challenges of recent years have increased the strain on women globally. We Prosper is a global coalition that engages in strategic advocacy to advance women's economic empowerment, justice, and rights by simultaneously challenging existing power structures and systems while amplifying the voice and agency of women and girls as economic actors. We put intersectional feminist considerations at the very center of our work. Together, we work with governments and policymakers to address structural barriers, enable women and girls to achieve their full potential, develop skills, gain access to resources, and be fully engaged in decision-making that impacts them and their families. Now is the time to catalyze global action on women's economic empowerment, justice, and rights.
Women stay in the house to look after their children. If you are not empowered, you cannot do that. Not being able to put food on the table for the children or take them to the hospital.
औरत अगर आगे बढ़ जाए तो उसके साथ परिवार भी बढ़ जाते हैं आगे। और जब महिला कोई भी काम करेगी तो वो अपनी भागीदारी घर में रख सकती है, घर में भी बाहर भी।
We Prosper promotes an evidence-based approach. This approach combines rigorous intersectional research together with evidence from the lived experience of women, girls, and historically marginalized groups to inform the most effective way forward in policy and increase funding to accelerate progress.
When you empower a girl, you're doing so to the whole village. It's a generational investment, and this generational investment translates into economic empowerment.
The society is changing, so women should be taken along too.
Clearly, the pandemic has had a devastating impact on gender equality. Gender-based violence increased by 60% in Mongolia.
As the core policy areas that donors and governments need to prioritize to ensure an inclusive recovery from the pandemic and longer-term gender equality.
Coalitions like We Prosper, bringing together organizations from a range of sectors, is what we need to address this issue collectively.
We know that high-quality, open, and regularly produced gender data leads to smarter policies that can advance women's economic empowerment.
Join us as we advance together towards global women's economic empowerment, justice, and rights.
Thanks so much, Kelsey, for that introduction and the video. And again, we're excited to welcome many more organizations to join this coalition as we unite our voices. I want to turn now to Wangari Kinoti to tell us a little bit more about the coalition and her perspectives on it, why this is the right moment, why this group is needed. Wangari is the Women's Rights and Feminist Alternatives lead at Action Aid International. She is a feminist and Pan-Africanist who has worked on a variety of program and policy initiatives in the region and within women's rights organizations. She is very active in the Pan-African South Third World feminist activist spaces with an interest in contributing to shaping a decolonial, radical, and caring future. I love that description of the future, Wangari. Great, over to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ritu. I think I'll start by saying it goes without saying that the current global, protracted, multiple and intersecting crises, so whether that's about climate, health, with certainly with COVID at the front of our minds, armed conflict, economic, food crises, and others, all these sort of protracted, multiple and intersecting crises are having adverse effects on women's lives, livelihoods, and rights. These crises draw subsidies from women's labor, whether it is unpaid or underpaid, and directly impacts our access to essential resources, to public services and wider protections, and also pose a constant threat to our bodily integrity and autonomy. So it is really therefore an honor to be part of this crucial coalition coming together at a time when there is increasing, not enough yet, but increasing global attention on women's economic empowerment, justice, and rights. I said women's economic empowerment, justice, and rights. And I think the terms are often used interchangeably and sometimes confused with each other. So for the avoidance of doubt, maybe it would be good to start with saying that overall, We Prosper seeks to contribute to the catalyzation of global action on women and the economy. This means that our approach is broad, but ultimately it aims to see that policy and funding go further than ever before to not only prevent setbacks, but to begin to see meaningful structural progress for the livelihoods and overall economic rights of women and girls across the globe. We see this coalition as a contributor to the past and present constellation of efforts, collaborations, and networks that have and continue to put women's economic justice on the agenda. We recognize and honor the feminist and women's rights activists, thinkers, rights defenders, labor organizers, and policy changers on whose shoulders we stand. So far, as Kelsey mentioned a few moments ago, We Prosper is bringing together more than 35 civil society organizations, academic institutions, advocacy organizations, women-led and feminist groups, as well as private sector entities working at local, national, and global level, who collectively focus on issues across the spectrum of women's economic empowerment, justice, and rights. So what we're offering is our collective depth and breadth of knowledge and experience to inform evidence-based decisions and actions related to policy and funding. And we're also connecting the dots from local through to global and vice versa, global through to local. And when we talk about evidence, we mean both what is traditionally understood by the term, so measurement tools, indicators, and other types of data, but crucially, also the lived experience and expertise of women, particularly those on the front lines of economic crises, who, largely and unfortunately still remain on the margins of mainstream economic policy. We are also guided by a set of principles, which I will run through, in summary, as they are what forms the core of how this coalition will work across everything that we do. Our approach is feminist and intersectional. So we're centering feminist alternatives to current approaches on women and the economy, and also prioritizing women at the intersection of different types of discrimination, whether that is based on race, ethnicity, caste, nationality, disability, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, migrant status, employment status, and others. As Kelsey mentioned, we are integrating and elevating a holistic conception of women's economic empowerment, justice, and rights. And in order to do this, we address the structural and systemic barriers that block the achievement of this for all women. The evidence is clear that there will be much more significant progress if we go beyond approaches that focus on women as individual economic actors to taking a more rights-based approach and addressing the more structural environment that determines the collective economic outcomes for women across the globe. We are deliberate about building and supporting the collective power and amplifying the voices of women in low and middle income countries. The global economic architecture as it stands now continues to deal a specific blow to women in the global south. And our aim is to zoom in on the factors that have led to this and to offer strategic solutions to reverse and address this. Finally, as far as our principles are concerned, as I mentioned earlier, our role is to build and utilize a global evidence base for women and the economy. And this is to guide strategic evidence-based advocacy to ultimately facilitate inclusive and sustainable processes that foster accountability. As I began by saying, we are in a state of crisis, and We Prosper is stepping up to do something about it. Now more than ever, we have to pull together, use evidence and the wide range of local to global expertise, including that of women and girls on the front lines, to ask the hard questions and face the harsh realities on what does and does not work. And then we must use this to shape our decisions and actions to find our way out of these crises and build futures in which women and all people can reclaim their rights and dignity. Asante sana, and thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Wangari, and we're so delighted to have you as part of our steering committee. Just wonderful to have your insights and activism and vision guiding us. So I want to introduce our panel now. We're going to have some time for a panel discussion to go a little bit more in depth on some of the things that Wangari mentioned. So first, let me introduce Frida Gituku, is the Executive Director of GROOTS Kenya, which is a national movement of grassroots women and girls whose mission is to facilitate women and girls' effective engagement and influence in development from the grassroots level. Frida is a vocal champion for gender justice in land governance, including serving on the International Land Coalition Africa Steering Committee. So thank you so much, Frida, for joining our coalition and our panel. Paromita Sen is the Research and Data Manager at Sewa Bharat, a national federation of Sewa organizations dedicated to women working in the informal economy. Paromita runs the in-house research unit at Sewa Bharat, which collects and evaluates evidence in support of women's informal work and their rights, entrepreneurship, and social security. Professor Judith Wawano is the hub leader at Kenyatta University, leader of the We Hub. She holds a doctorate in nutrition education and is a professor in the Department of Food, Nutrition, and Dietetics at Kenyatta University. She has taught there for 35 years and is a researcher in the area of nutrition, health, and education. Frida, Paromita, and Judith all serve on the We Prosper Steering Committee with myself, Wangari, and Kelsey. I also want to introduce and welcome Shirley Price, the president of the Jamaica Household Workers Union. Shirley established and serves as president of the first ever domestic workers union in Jamaica. She's also chairs the Caribbean Domestic Workers Network and sits on several other boards and committees, including the International Domestic Workers Federation. So thanks to all of you for joining us. The first question for you as a panel is to really talk about the structural issues. As we all know, discrimination against women and girls plays out in so many different ways, large and small. But one of the large ways it plays out is in how economies are structured. So would love to turn to each of you to explore and sort of bring to light for us how these structural issues play out in regard to what you work on. So Frida, first over to you to help us explore land rights.
All right, thank you very much, Ritu. I am excited that the We Prosper Coalition is really will really be interrogating these structural and systemic barriers to women economic empowerment and justice. And here we are talking about interrogating the things at the macro and micro level, informal and informal spaces, but also using those barriers on the flip side to drive or accelerate transformation. From where I sit, there are key pillars that underlie women economic empowerment and economic justice. And if you'd allow me, I can just say in passing, one, of course, is around the regulatory frameworks. There are also social norms. There's the issue around access to productive resources, which I'll be zooming into very soon. The business practice, the practice at the private sector, the issue of women's voice and agency, and most importantly, something that we are very familiar with, which is the issue of care work and how much it can derail women economic empowerment and justice. But allow me to zoom into access to productive resources and specifically women land rights, because this is one of the most opaque and least talked about issue within the women movement, but even in the development space at large. And there are reasons why we don't want to delve into these issues, or why governments are unwilling even to report on the related indicators, land indicators of the SDGs. And largely it is because of the potential that it has to disturb power. And that is really where the transformations rest in. The Land Inequality Report released in 2021 by International Land Coalition shows that globally, most of the land is concentrated in the hands of foreign corporations and states. Both of those institutions we know that are very male dominated. And this land that is concentrated in the hands of foreign corporations and in the state is under large scale investments. Again, we do understand that most of these large scale investments, women serve or offer their services there as laborers and not as shareholders. And most of them are anyway under very capitalistic models of production, which feminist analysis have demonstrated that capitalism model of development cannot deliver women from poverty. So if you look at the other side, the small and the medium land holding, unfortunately, it is not any better, where we seem to have more women participating on land. It is not any better because, again, most of these lands are controlled by men for cultural reasons, which seem to even be very difficult, not just for the society, but for the state to overcome. And even though women have access to this small and medium land holding, they do not have control and ownership. And those two things mean very different things. Because when you have control over land, it means you can leverage on it to access capital. You can use it as your social security. You can trade it and convert it to a different form of outcome, and you can also develop it. But you find that across, especially the third world, the rights that women have over land are very secondary. It's a right to use it, but not to make a decision on how that land should be developed, on how it should change hands, whether you can convert it to other form of resources, which of course derail the cause for women economic empowerment. The other thing worth noting is that the way land is governed affects how we access public services, and particularly public land. This is land that ideally is supposed to be used to develop public facilities like hospitals, water points, you know, and other public utilities. Majority of the poor people are women and girls, meaning they are the ones who rely largely on public services. So when these public lands are mismanaged or not fully utilized to give public services, you're denying women an opportunity to develop themselves, to access those services, and it means they have to look for private services, which of course means more out-of-pocket expenses. And again, that is really undermining to this call of women economic empowerment and justice. Majority of the women in the third world country rely on land for food. They are artisanal miners. They are, you know, they are relying on it for not access to natural resources. And so when they do not have full control, full ownership, it means we are denying most of their basic rights, which include the right to food, right to water, and also the options to have quality housing. We've seen in most of the interventions that Growth has delivered, where we've put control and ownership of women land is central to our programming, that it has transformed household income. It gives the woman more power to make decisions. We've seen them increase their quality of housing, building new homes or upgrading their current homes to something much more better. And we've even seen that majority of those women whose security of tenure gets secured are more likely to put their children and their spouses into the National Health Insurance Fund, because they have now the ability to land serves as an enabler. So land rights for women is central to women economic empowerment and justice, and it is in the intersectional approach to development. It's something that we must carry forward and be conscious of the powers that want to suppress that agenda because of its ability to disturb and distribute power. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Frida. I mean, access to land as a productive asset is so foundational. It's just so incredibly foundational. So thank you for bringing that to light. Paromita, I want to turn to you to talk about informality.
Hi, thank you so much, Ritu, and thank you so much, We Prosper, for having me here. So I'm here to talk about a little bit about women's economic empowerment in the world of informality. So when we discuss women in work, one of the things we really need to note is that the informality of work that women engage in, right? So over 95% of women's economic work in South Asia is in the informal sector. And it is a little bit better elsewhere, but really not by much, right? So you're talking about like over 85% in Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, and over 70% in South America. So all women working, close to 80 to 90% are in the informal sector, which means these are women who are working without the protection of labor laws. They're women working without social security and no kind of like support in their work and under really hazardous conditions. And these are just to name a few issues. And the barriers to improving to improving women's employment and entrepreneurship, it isn't just a question of just getting them that job, right? For these women, they're facing burdens of unpaid care work, they're facing challenges around mobility, family and societal norms, as Frida's already mentioned, and I think more people will mention in this panel. We're talking about regulatory challenges, we're talking about lack of capacity building, we're just talking about a host of issues that women face when trying to get out of the informal economy, transitioning from the informal to the formal, or trying to increase the quality of work and increasing the dignity of their jobs, right? So for instance, if we take, I think the example of women banking correspondents, which are women who are involved in the cash in, cash out networks to increase when people's vulnerable communities access to finances, right? These women, first of all, have to fight a long way to ensure that their families and their society allows them to access employment. However, some of these areas that they're working in, so one of the cases out of India, they work in a hilly terrain. They can't access adequate digital infrastructure to do their job properly, and there's very little public transportation that allows them to scale up their work in significant ways, right? So we're not just talking about getting these women access to a decent paying job in a dignified setting, right? It's all of these other issues you need to figure out. You need to ensure there is infrastructure. You need to ensure that there is the kind of informal settlements that women live in. You need to ensure that women have access to water and sanitation and are able to get to work, right? And they're not spending 3 hours a day just going and getting water, right? Which is the kind of burden that informal economy workers and just women across the space globally are facing. And in this space, one of the things that we have seen that really works, and why I'm so excited to be part of this coalition, right, is that collectivization becomes so critical for these women, right? And collectivization is really hard, right? So informal women workers are most of the time, they're very isolated in their work. If you think about domestic workers, they're going and working with their employers. There's really an opportunity for domestic workers to get together and work, right? Or street vendors, to some extent, home-based workers are working out of their home, right? So what does that mean for them when it comes to trying to figure out what it is, the solidarity network that they need to tap into to be able to overcome these issues? And we've seen that collectivization is critical because it provides them the agency and the means to fight all these multiple battles on multiple fronts. It's not one person fighting 12 battles, it's 300 people fighting the 12 battles, and they can divide and conquer, right? We're talking about increased bargaining power, we're talking about the potential to share capital and resources, advocate, and the solidarity in spirit. However, collectivization is complicated and is challenging given the nature of that work. So within the space of like informal workers and the kind of issues they face, collectivization is critical. And it's important to look at this from this intersectional lens that this coalition looks at. I mean, given all the speakers in this panel. However, it's challenging, and this isn't going to be an easy battle. It's been something that we've seen some changes in over the years, but it's a long battle ahead of us. And we look to our partners in government and across the space to support us in this battle and to see where we go from here.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Ritu. Yes.
Thank you so much, Paromita. And I think, this collectivization concept is so key in pushing for rights changes and for, just as you're saying, access to basic services, which are so needed. Judith, I want to turn to you to talk about gender-based violence and how that is a structural barrier to women's economic empowerment. And often we don't think about gender-based violence as a structural barrier. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. I want to talk about the gender-based violence. And before we address the gender-based violence, in improving the economic empowerment of women, you have to talk about barriers, structural barriers that hinder economic empowerment for women. And I want to share some of the structural barriers that have actually been a hindrance related to gender-based violence. One is the patriotic society that has normalized male gender and privileged and has privileged and marginalized women at all levels and everywhere. If you look in the global world, you find that men are regarded like a privileged group, and they have all the rights, they have all ownership of all the property. So that normalization actually worked to the detrimental of women. Number two, the social norms that have stereotyped gender roles. Again, globally, you are finding that this is backed by cultural and religious beliefs that do not support women economic rights and empowerment. So that is a big barrier, and again, it's a global thing. The third issue in terms of structural barriers that needs to be addressed in this We Prosper coalition is the structure of society where the male gender has access and control to major resources, including the female gender. And that actually disadvantages the female, especially when they go through these violence instances, from reporting, from access to getting medical care, and to actually dealing with the court cases. So that is a big obstacle for that. And then the other barrier we have seen across the globe is the lack of infrastructure to handle issues when gender-based violence occur. These arise from even a lack of information of where to report and how to report, handling such cases, seeking medical care, and what kind of rehabilitation centers they can be able to get some assistance. So that is also another barrier that we've seen across the globe. The other barrier, and actually the greatest seen, is poverty. Poverty is actually the greatest sin to gender-based violence, and is what makes the survivors stay in this cycle of violence. You find that many of the women, because they can't afford anything, so they stay within, or they go to the rehabilitation center and come back again to the same environment where this violence is inflicted. Yeah, so what is the We Prosper and the KU Kenyatta University Women Hub doing? In order to promote women economic empowerment, it's important to gather evidence on what works to improve or to remove these structural barriers in order to improve women economic empowerment. And what we have seen across the literature is that unless these barriers are removed, achieving gender parity in all spheres of life remains a pipe to do. So basically what this coalition is doing is actually to bring out collective and meaningful changes to these structural issues. That's the reason for us participating in this coalition. So basically we are here to remove the barriers and be able to provide enabling environments to promote women economic empowerment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judith, for that. And Shirley, finally to you, we've known that care work is a structural barrier, right? For 50 or 60 years, right? We've known this, we've lived it, we've experienced it. So share with us more about how care work intersects with women's economic empowerment, and also what the solutions are going forward. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me. And thank you for having Domestic Worker Voice at this very important forum. Thank you. When we think of women economic empowerment, we need to pause at who are the women we are empowering. Because we live in an unequal world, it is no secret that class, race, and other forms of structural barriers have stood out in the way of economic empowerment of all women. Therefore, from a structural approach, we need to go back at the root source of gender economic.
Oops, Shirley, I think somehow your volume is muted. There you are.
Of domestic work. Domestic work is the form of labor that makes all other work possible. Valorizing it within a system of care that is inclusive is key for women economic empowerment. Our sector is already vulnerable because domestic works are mostly women who carry burdens of both unpaid care in their home, in their own homes, and under the paid care in their employer's house. They become even poorer when boys and girls are born into economically disadvantaged families. Boys have more chances to improve their economic situation as they grow, but as women enter their peak productive and reproductive years, the possibility that they will experience extreme poverty. And this has increased from 4% to 22%. This is because of the uneven burden of care and child care, elderly care, etc. They have to do many jobs that are particularly uncompensated for employers and even within their own family. So we particularly need to adopt the ILO 5R framework, which is recognize, redistribute, reduce, reward, and represent. We need to recognize domestic work not only as work, but also as part of the care economy. Usually, when domestic workers are not included in care, it is a class difference because our care workers, like nurses, has access to formal education. It is because of inequality that we domestic workers are not able to have the same access to education. But we perform similar jobs in care for the elderly and for children. Redistribute means we are saying that domestic workers cover gaps of the state. For example, the state should provide social health care, but it does not. So domestic workers take additional responsibilities where they work to assist the sick. The labor of caring should be redistributed between workers, and government should also receive care. If they provide care for their employers, who will provide care for them? To reduce, the government should provide quality and affordable service to workers to reduce the burden on domestic care. At the same time, many domestic workers work for between 14 and 12 hours a day, have only one day off. We need to reduce these constraints like working hours so it matches the provision like all other workers. Reward. Domestic workers in many places is under the National Living is not under the national living or minimum wage. So it is very underpaid. If we want to reform the care economy, domestic workers must be cared for and have wages that reflect their work. And lastly, we look at represent. These changes can be achieved by representing domestic workers in policy making, giving them a seat at the table. This is the agenda for our federation, the International Domestic Worker Federation, who actively works on this. We are glad that to be part of this coalition and move forward women economic empowerment. So no woman should be left behind. And we are saying that we need the government, public, everyone to care for those who care for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. And thanks to all our panelists. I want to turn now to the more positive. I think many of the challenges that you all brought forward have been with us for decades, if not centuries. And you know, as we compare where we are now in our movement to where we were, say, in 1995 at the Beijing Women's Conference, it's easy to become discouraged in terms of the direction of change. So I want to ask each of you to share with us a success story about how these issues were effectively incorporated into policy based on your recommendations, or how these are finding their way into research that is shaping policy. So we'll travel the same order that we did the first time around. So Frida, over to you.
Thank you, Ritu. I think research is critical in shaping policy. One, because it helps us to define a problem. These are complex power issues, complex development issues. So it's not always obvious that people will understand them. And like I mentioned before, is that especially the issue of land rights, it's very opaque. So we often, even in my organization and in the coalition, we often use research to try and define the problem and make people understand the extent to which it is derailing progress. Of course, also in sustaining the political narrative, because there'll always be very many counter narratives trying to either stop women from enjoying their rights, arguing that it is not good for social order, and all those anti-feminist arguments that we've had, but also using research to negotiate for resource allocation and to monitor policy implementation. There are a couple of things that have happened. I don't know whether we can term them as policy, but have accelerated progress. Like, for example, in my country, there's a provision for spousal consent in transaction of land, meaning that if we have matrimonial property, if the husband or the wife want to trade on that property, they require to have a consent from their spouses. And we've seen, although it hasn't achieved the success that we envision, there are isolated cases that grassroots women and rural women will report to us that because of that provision and because Land Controls Board are enforcing it, there are women who have been saved from disinheritance or dispossession, even when they're in marriage or when they've been divorced or lost their spouses. Of course, even because of the policy adjustment, we've seen that it is much more in cases of divorce now. The women are much more able to assert their rights over division of property. And this has come from a lot of historical and long-standing advocacy from women rights organizations, from land rights movements in the country. There's still a big challenge because, you know, there is always other things related to it. What is the cost of justice? Yes, there's a policy and women can go to court and claim their rights to matrimonial property, but can they actually be able to afford those court fees? as they are today. In terms of public land, we've seen in areas where women have organized to identify and create inventories of their own public land, that they've actually been able to use those inventories to influence government to invest in them, provide them with water, open up roads, set up hospitals, which means that then women have more access to public services and they are less poorer because they can afford things that are really critical to them. In situations of where women are living in community land, where they have gained more access to security of tenure, they are able to look for investors and partners to invest on those land to develop group projects or projects that are run by community-based organizations. We know largely that in Africa and in many third world countries that women are organized in community groups. So there are cases where when policy interventions increase the sense, even if it is perceived security of tenure for women, that they pull together to invest on that land to get themselves out of poverty, or they will partner with external partners to invest in land for their own income, or they'll demand of government to invest in public land so that they can access public facilities.
Thank you so much, Frida. No, I know from my own experience, I've seen many of these success stories at the local village level, and slowly, right? Sort of 1 hectare at a time, things do begin to change. Palomita, over to you to talk about progress that we've made in informality.
Yeah, so I'm a researcher who's going to take the policy response just to shake things up a little bit. So one of the things that we realized back when our movement started was that informal sector workers needed access to formal finance to be able to invest in their homes, invest in their work, but they had very little collateral to put up against this investment. When we go for a loan, we have to show that we have the assets and a collateral to be able to put up against this, right? So Frida, for instance, has mentioned how land is very often the thing and women don't have access to this land. So Seva Bank, so the movement came up with this idea of being like, came up with the idea of mutual guarantee, which essentially capitalized on the collateral that women do have, which is our social network and our capital, as our capital, right? The social network that we exist within. By using mutual guarantee, women within the movement started repaying loans at significantly higher rates than the national average, which is something then that Seva Bank and the movement paired up with others trying to work around this idea, and allowed for mutual guarantee to become something that could replace collateral, establishing the base for what we now know as the microcredit movement, which has gone on to become the dominant mode of women accessing finance globally, and therefore allowing, like, impacting women's lives at both the public and private level, right? So the idea of, like, this is something that comes about from women coming together and being like, what is it that we do have, right? We might not have access to land, we might not have access to assets, to jewelry, or any of those kinds of things, but what do we have, which is our social network, which is these connections, the networks that women do have to build and rely on to get them through something. But this is one of those, like, big, large-scale policy actions that took a lot of time, right? But this is not to say that small-scale actions don't have an immediate effect, right? And I'm going to take something right from the COVID pandemic that was going on. So lots of governments world over were giving relief packages to people. And this was something that happened within the Seva, within, like, Delhi, within India as well. So within Delhi, they were giving out resources, which had a lot of, like, dry staples and stuff to ensure that families have food to make it through the lockdowns. Over here, the Seva community collected some feedback and gave it to the government, and the government ended up taking it very seriously, thank God, where it essentially were like, you're giving us these dry rations and stuff, but this isn't what is needed in the community at this moment, right? And let's figure out ways to make these relief packages more helpful. And then the government pivoted, right? They started including iron tablets, they started including menstruation products, and something as simple as spices and oil for cooking, right? You can give dry staples, what are you going to cook it with, right? And this was something that resulted in, like, a week into the COVID pandemic, they switched this out and the government started providing relief packages, which really substantially helped communities in need, right? And over here, what we're seeing is that taking this feedback from the community results in policy actions that do have slightly more of an impact and can have long-lasting impact, but also short-lasting impacts. And that is critical for us moving forward, the short wins and the big wins.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have to sustain ourselves on those short wins as we work towards the big wins. Judith, in terms of the research on sexual gender-based violence, tell us more about how you're making this link between GBV and economics through your research?
Thank you very much. At Conde University, we decided to carry out a research to see the economic cost of GBV on women's economic survivors who have graduated from rehabilitation centers within the Nairobi County. So we did that because when we did a literature search, we found that there wasn't any literature showing the economic costs of the women who have actually gone through gender-based violence. So we did a research in Nairobi on the rescue and response rehabilitation centers. What we found out from the research, we found that a majority of them took a lot of time, following up all these instances of SGBV. We also found that a lot of time of their work time was spent actually going to report and also being away from their home environment, especially those ones who have been hosted at the safe houses. We also find out from them that most of them, they suffered physical, psychosocial, emotional, economic, and sexual and social violence. So in terms of violence, all forms of violence were exhibited among those survivors. We also found that the husband and boyfriends were identified as the major perpetrators of those crimes. And again, we found that the survivors, most of them sought psychological counseling, medical help, and then legal help. Only a few sought to go to the rehabilitation center because they were afraid of what they have as far as stigma was concerned. We found that those who went to the rehabilitation center, the rehabilitation centers had a positive effect on the survivors as it helped them, regain their instinct worthy. Yeah, so it did some service to them, and majority of them said that the mere fact of earning something, those who are referred to different programs, it made them feel independent, and they felt that experience was worthwhile. So in other words, those who were exposed to some economic intervention programs saw the effect and the usefulness of it, and it made them more independent than the ones who didn't. So from this research, we actually came up with the policy recommendations. And one of the policy recommendations we had is that the rescue centers had some economic aspect directly or indirectly when they were referred to other organizations. We also found out that the management approach to gender-based violence should be multifaceted and versatile so that it can address the multi-forms of violence experienced by these survivors. As I told you earlier on, they experience all sorts of violence. So they are asking for a different approach to be able to be instilled in those response centers. They also noted that there's need for strong interface between gender-based violence programs and the household, because in most cases, some of them go to the safe house for a short time, and then they go back to the same cycle where there is violence, is taking place. So in those programs, we need to actually institute programs that can take care of them so that when they go back home, they're going in a safe environment. So this research created a demand for a national policy on a rescue center operation. We also found out from this research that most of the rehabilitation centers are run by private organizations. The government doesn't have this, but recently there was a call by the Ministry for Public Service and Gender to establish some safe houses operated by the government. So for me, I feel that's the right step so that they can be able to be taken over. So basically, in these programs, they also need some economic, skilling so that when they come out from these rescue centers, they can be self-empowered. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think one of the themes that's coming out from all of your comments is the importance of influencing national governments, right, to get to scale. So Shirley, tell us a little bit about what you and your union has done in response to the pandemic, but also what some of the transformative care policies actually look like at the national level.
Thank you. When the pandemic hit, domestic workers organization responded not only with relief work, but also policy negotiation for a social solidarity economy to receive care through 3 pathways: social protection, security, and services. Informally employed paid care work like us domestic workers and registered without written contract are often excluded from employment entitlement and from social protection, especially migrant workers. The pandemic hit us real hard because we were left behind. Most of us didn't get any of the care package or the care funding or whatever the government call it. We didn't get any because we didn't have the access to get any benefit because of, from whatever reason, we were left behind. So we have to go there and try to help ourselves, working with our federation, get solidarity fund, get grant funding to help us to do alternate livelihood and to help us, restart. So transformative care policies consider the needs and rights of both caregivers and care receivers. It is not only to provide service, but also change the power dynamic and the inequality that governs the world of work. Workers in Bangladesh, for example, build on their historic effort and creating the Domestic Workers Protection and Welfare Policy of 2015 to lobby for coverage during the pandemic. In practice, Uruguay, one of the few countries and the only country in Latin America to have developed an integrated approach to care that considered both care providers and recipients, to which it's defined in policy instruction, example, the 2015 laws and the National Integrated System of Care. Also in Chile, Costa Rica, El Salvador, they are also working towards the National Integrated System of Care. In South Africa, the CODA in regulation of health and safety at work now covers domestic worker. In the Caribbean, most laws for workers are also, domestic workers are also included. In Jamaica, all the legislation include domestic worker. And this include our newly Sexual Harassment Act of 2021. Domestic workers also included. Parliament unanimously in 2011 passed the Jamaica Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedom, which bars discrimination on the basis of male and female. So this is a right step in where we want to go. We ourselves from the Jamaica Household Worker Union set up a Household Worker Training Institute supported by our federation, because we believe that education is one way out of poverty. We have to upskill ourselves to have better negotiation. You can negotiate better and to get better pay, so we can stand and be counted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley, and thanks for that the power of your activism and the results that you're having. So as we just have a few minutes left, just want to invite our panelists to say a few words, 1 or 2 minutes, on what you hope this coalition can accomplish, what you hope that we can do together. And let's go, Judith, to you first, and then we'll go to Paromita.
Thank you very much. As I conclude, I want to say that We Prosper is a new kid on the block. We all need to join our hands to nurture this baby to grow in order to promote gender equality and economic rights for women and girls. We Prosper can also be impactful at all levels, as we have seen from the presentation, from evidence gathering, capacity building, advocacy, and dissemination. And it can also be impactful to all audience, including men, because we need to hold men on board to make gender equity. The concept of inclusiveness, simplicity, bottom-up approach will make a difference in capturing the voices of the audience. We Prosper can be impactful by developing effective communication strategy to reach all this audience. Kenyatta University, Economic Environment Hub commits to support We Prosper Coalition by providing the evidence, policy briefs, intervention programs, stakeholder engagement, and advocacy. We see We Prosper in turn can help us access participating organizations to meaningful global evidence, which can provide invaluable support to regional activities, making them stronger and more impactful as a result. We commit to support We Prosper in the dissemination of evidence. We stand with the We Prosper Coalition, and we welcome everybody on board. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Paromita.
I think everyone said it so much better than me already, but essentially change is slow, but it takes solidarity and collective action to ensure that change isn't transient and easily rolled back. I look to this coalition to ensure that the change that we make is change that sticks, and I count on it because this is such a diverse range of stakeholders and actors from a variety of platforms, areas, modalities of actions. We're talking about international organizations, grassroots organizations, research, implementation, just across the board. And I think this is just a very exciting space to be in, to push work that's really intersectional and really holistic moving forward in the next few years.
Great, thank you. Shirley.
Yes, the coalition is an effort to bring women, organization, and national and integration to lead discussion and the integrated core policies and strategies. This is very important for feminized sector such as ours to be heard on topics that domestic workers are traditionally excluded from, such as the fiscal policy, progressive taxation, social health care, gender transformative economic policies. Change does not happen without both a legitimate leadership from the ground up and without power coalition that speak to the intersection across sector and context. CARE has its own programming, but CARE on its own, and CARE in itself is a holistic framework. We invest in CARE. We don't only think of the service, but also the process. Investing is not a band-aid solution. It needs to alleviate the inequality that creates that care crisis to begin with. And this is the agenda that we hope to push forward. We, the International Domestic Worker Federation, is very happy to be part of this initiative. Time comes for strong changes. Collectively, we will stop the whisper and we will start shout. Because our action must not be quarantine. We need changes, and we're gonna stand together, we're gonna fight together, and we're gonna win together. And guess what? We're gonna be bold together for changes. Time come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Frida.
Yes, so I believe that We Prosper will provide leadership on feminist research to provide evidence that is demand-driven. We are producing evidence about women, but we need to be sure that it is the evidence that the women demand to be able to change their lives and do advocacy, but also to provide evidence on the hidden evidence that comes from the qualitative stories that the women tell and that cannot be captured in the traditional methods of producing evidence. That's where I see We Prosper really intervening very critically. Also, I see We Prosper in the next 5 years mobilizing multi-agency stakeholders, because we acknowledge that the power to effect change does not rest in civil society only or government only or in the World Bank. It is all of us have to push the wheel of change together, whether we like each other or not. So I see We Prosper providing a lot of leadership in mobilizing those multi-agencies. But most importantly, I also see We Prosper manifesting what it means to be intersectional in development, providing that thought leadership, but also showcasing it to the world so that other people can learn, because there are many actors in the women economic empowerment space. And in policy prioritization, I see the coalition prioritizing policies that have a mass impact on the people who are most left behind.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us and for being part of the new coalition. I think, Shirley, I loved what you said in terms of legitimate leadership from the bottom up. And I think for me, that's one of the most exciting things about this coalition, is that it's bringing legitimate leadership, knowledge, evidence, experience, stories, from the grassroots up to the global, and aligning us all together, as you said, Frida, to put our shoulders to the wheel of change. So I want to thank everyone for joining us and hope that you'll get engaged with us. The contact information is in the chat. We are an open coalition. We're welcoming more members. We'll be convening more dialogues. You'll be seeing more evidence coming out from us. We will be joining our voices to speak to global institutions as well as national government. So really want to invite all of you to be part of this effort, to join your voice with ours, so that we can bring this really holistic and ground truthed agenda to all the places where change needs to happen. So thanks again to you all. And thanks so much. We're going to end just right on time. Thanks so much, colleagues. Wishing you the best for the rest of your day.